Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to a special edition of Popcorn and Compliance. While we typically look at the movies, over this short podcast series, Megan Dougherty, co-founder of One Stone Creative, and myself will take a look at The Falcon and the Winter Soldier. So not technically a movie, but streaming on the Disney platform, so that's close enough during this pandemic. Over this series, we will take a look at the storylines, some of the cookies and other cool things. We'll describe the great action scenes from each episode, and then we'll take a look at issues raised by each episode. It's going to be a lot of fun. We will take things from the societal angle, from the social justice angle, from the MCU angle, and perhaps even from the compliance angle. But if you're an MCU fan or you're a compliance fan, I know you will enjoy. In this first episode, we take a look at episodes 1 and 2 of The Falcon and the Winter Soldier. This podcast is a special production of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, together with Megan Dougherty. Megan, as all listeners to my podcast know, is the producer extraordinaire on multiple podcasts on the Compliance Podcast Network and for others. And we are going to treat you to a podcast series on the Falcon and the Winter Soldier series. So, Megan, first of all, welcome.
Thank you. Always happy to be here.
So we're going to go through the synopsis of each episode. Then Megan's going to tell us about some cookies and cool stuff. And then we're going to open the floor for discussion between ourselves. And we're going to go through each episode. This first podcast will be episodes 1 and 2, and then we'll get caught up, and then we're going to do this on a weekly basis. So with episode 1, 6 months after the half of all life returned from the blip, Sam Wilson, a.k.a. Falcon, stops George Batroc, the terrorist group LAF, who have hijacked a plane and taken a hostage over Tunisia with the support of U.S. Air Force First Lieutenant Joaquin Torres. Wilson, who's been given the mantle of Captain America by Steve Rogers, struggles with this idea and decides to give Rogers' shield to the U.S. government for a display at the Smithsonian. Bucky Barnes, a.k.a. the Winter Soldier, who is recently pardoned, attends government-mandated therapy sessions, which we will take a deep dive into later. He discusses his attempts to make amends for his time as a brainwashed assassin, a.k.a. the Winter Soldier. Torres, Wilson's sidekick, investigates another terrorist group, the Flag Smashers, who believe that life was better during the blip. Torres is injured by a member of the group with superhuman strength when he witnesses them rob a bank in Switzerland. He later informs the Falcon of this, who has been attempting to help his reluctant sister Sarah with the family fishing business in Delacroix, Louisiana. The government soon announces a new Captain America, much to the chagrin of Sam Wilson, that is John Walker. So there are lots of deliciously fun cookies in this. What were some of the ones that piqued your interest, Megan?
Okay, you're right. There were so many of them. And the first one that I really noticed was just how cool that museum exhibit was in DC and how they'd added all of this, like all of the blip content. And there was a lot about Cap's relationship with Bucky and what had happened to the Avengers. So I thought that was really, really interesting. I guess, although before that, this was a little one with Red Wing, the Falcon's little drone, beeped in response when he gave him a command like R2-D2, but sounded like a bird. So well done there for the details. One little thing that was interesting, right after Sam had donated the shield and he was looking at it in its glass case and you could see it superimposed on the reflection. I think they've used that motif a lot in the MCU, whether or not someone can see themselves in the role that they're being asked to fill. And he was off kilter. He didn't fit it. So I thought that was fascinating. And then just 10 points for the most awkward therapy session of all time, which was wonderful. And sidebar, I first heard the name the Flag Smashers and that they were all for a world without borders. And I was like, okay, great, awesome, new good guys. This is going to be fantastic. And then they were all just like, oh yeah, the genocide was awesome. And that was very sad. So that was a little bit of a roller coaster for me. What about yours? What were your favorite cookies and cool parts?
So the Smithsonian ceremony I thought was great. A fishing boat. Actually, I saw that as a homage to Forrest Gump. It was a shrimp boat. So I thought that was cool. The thing I've been thinking about is what do superheroes do for money? Because obviously Batman is Bruce Wayne, so he doesn't need money. Superman had a real job. He's a reporter at the Daily Planet. And indeed, the Flash, he hangs out by the railroad track, so he doesn't need a lot of money. Wonder Woman has a job. I'm not sure. Ultron, he was going to destroy the world, so he really didn't need a job. The Hulk, he's in hiding. So when he's Dr. Banner, Sarah Johansson, the assassin, she assassinates people, so she gets paid for that. Iron Man.
I mean, not too recently. No,
not too recently. Iron Man, he doesn't need money because he's Tony Stark. So the Green Arrow had a job. Superboy didn't need a job because he lived with his parents. We never really had to deal with this. One of the Enterprise episodes, actually it was the second movie, Captain Picard announced or told the 20th century Earth person that they had evolved past money. So when someone asked how much does the starship cost? So I thought that was really interesting. And of course it was wrapped around really an ongoing discussion about discrimination and racism in America, which certainly is appropriate for this time. But I would have thought, first of all, I would have thought Sam would have been paid by the U.S. government because he's certainly doing U.S. government work. And I would have thought a bank would have loved to have had him as a lender or as a borrower, because then they can say, hey, we service the Falcon. So I thought that was all really interesting on multiple levels. Anything for you on that?
Yeah, well, I agree with you. And I thought it was particularly interesting. It was almost a throwaway. They said, you don't have any lending or money history for the last 5 years because you didn't exist. And that kind of introduces the whole topic of post-blip logistics. How were all of these people, reintegrated into society? Dealing with the same issue that, our new big bad guys are dealing with was it better before? Was it easier before? What are things looking like now? And just in terms of the money, I think they might have their own merch lines and run them. Because I'm completely serious. Do you remember, on licensing fees? Because if you remember in Infinity War, they talked about the ice cream flavors. There was Stark Raving Hazelnuts and then Hunka Hulka Burning Fudge. I wonder if they'll have their own merch. And fan clubs.
Well, I'm sure they would license, to certain reputable vendors. Ben and Jerry would be a key one for me in terms of their sustainability efforts. Mm-hmm. What did you think about? You mentioned the therapy sessions, and so let's go into that a little bit. I don't guess I'm letting out too much information to say I've sat in one or two.
Oh, yes, same here.
They have not been.
If the therapist was that good, I'd still be there.
Mine were not that confrontational, but certainly in episode 1, I felt like she was appropriate to kind of break through to Bucky. Any thoughts from your perspective?
And it really felt like you can't possibly understand. And I know he's there very much because this is the condition of him, being able to be a free person. And I think he is very much not willing or ready to deal with everything that has happened. Because, he was this brainwashed bad supervillain for 70 years, heals, goes into a big war, then loses his best friend, the only connection that he had to the past. And now is being treated, I guess, fairly by the government, but having to do all of this internal work that he doesn't want to. And yeah, I think it was a really realistic portrayal of someone who does not want to be dealing with their internal life, but being forced to.
What did you think about the amends?
That was interesting because, I guess I'm most familiar with amends. It's what you do in AA when you're working the program. I hadn't thought about it really in terms of supervillain recovery. But I guess there can be the parallel there, perhaps. I like that he was being no, he wasn't being technically honest about whether or not he followed the steps. But I think he was following the spirit of making amends, if not the letter of the rules.
Do you think that worked in terms of the older Chinese gentleman he was befriending, and we found out why at the end?
I found that a little bit hard to watch because I really liked their friendship. I liked the relationship they had and the way they were talking, because I think, kind of chronologically, the older man would be a peer of Bucky's. They, were born at around the same time, would have had the same earlier inputs into their life, and he really liked the guy. And I don't think he was ready to face the pain that he caused him.
The thing that struck me that's different about certainly the AA 12-step program and the amends and what Bucky's making is that in the AA 12-step program, you are excused from an amend if in doing so, it will hurt the person you're making the amends to. So I really thought about that, certainly in terms of the Chinese gentleman, because frankly, I struggled with what amends he could make other than bare his soul and say, I murdered your son.
Yeah, and I mean, that really could go either way, right? Because having the closure and knowing what happened would be one thing, but then an additional feeling of betrayal for this person who would become your friend, that's rough.
And there I contrasted it with Jason Bourne at the end of the second Bourne movie, where he meets the daughter of the two Russians he had assassinated in, I think Munich, but perhaps Berlin. And he broke into her house and told her that his parents had not committed suicide, or his mother had not killed her father. He had killed them both. And so I thought that was a qualitative difference between what Bucky was trying to do, because he was trying to correct the truth or correct the historical record by spilling the truth to her so that she might have some comfort that her parents actually did not only love each other, but loved her. So that was the closest I could come, but I still think it was a little bit different than what Bucky was doing.
Yeah, I think he's going to find it easier to functionally right wrongs more than emotionally right them. Because he had empowered the senator to be corrupt, and he was able to put a stop to that. And that was an objectively, good action to take for America. It's less clear cut when it's an individual's relationship with a family member.
So what about the contrast between the friendships of Bucky, the Winter Soldier, and Steve, and then Wilson, the Falcon, and Steve? What did you see different? Did you see anything different in their friendships with Captain America, and then contrast that even further with their friendship with each other?
Bucky and Steve, I mean, they went way back. They were the original friends. And so they had a really long history to build on. Wilson and the Captain, the relationship started more professionally. And I think it kind of came from, a mutual respect that built while they were doing work together. And I think, right now, Bucky and Sam do not care for each other's company, which makes for great watching. But I feel like they're going to grow in respect for each other, starting professionally, and then it's going to move into the more emotional, I respect you as a person, as well as a fellow superhero type of way. That's my prediction.
Let me turn now to, I thought it was John, but it's Joaquin Torres. I thought he was one of the most irritating characters I've seen in many a moon.
I liked him.
Because he's a little elf on the shelf, or what?
I just thought he was, well, the first thing I thought when we came on the screen is like, yes, there's the Marvel levity in the person of Torres. And I think he's really well-meaning. He's the straight man is kind of how I'm seeing him being played right now. Is he believes that he's doing the right thing and he's being helpful as much as possible. And he maybe wants to be a little cooler or more well-known than he is. I thought it was kind of sweet.
He was kind of sweet, but I guess I was concerned that if he's the point person for the Falcon on these missions, he seems to be so you can become a second lieutenant basically when you're 21 in America. You go to college, go to ROTC, you come out as a second lieutenant, as an officer.
But you're still basically a kid.
With zero experience. And that's really what I got the sense from him, particularly in the first scene. It was a lot of wows and oohs and ahs and not a lot of technical support.
Well, that was kind of the part of Sam's whole experience there being in was it Tunisia? He was on a pretty big, important looking mission with very few resources. He had this one point person and no backup. That comes back to the money thing. Maybe the government is financing him and they're trying to cut corners or keep their budgets low.
Probably should say a few words about the opening sequence, which was just one of the most outrageously great action sequences. I don't think we'd be giving anything away to say it's the Falcon in pursuit of first a helicopter and then a plane. And
a great epic canyon chase. Oh.
And it was. You knew you were on for a roller coaster ride. The opening with Bucky was a little slower, but still just as powerful. Was there anything that you saw either gave you pause or concerned you about future episodes?
Well, one actually was kind of a callback. Because, I mean, it started off with that, I think it was the Steve Rogers voice in his head doing the shield handover. He really frequently, I've gotten big letters here with an exclamation point, wing shield. He was using his wings very much the way Cap used the shield, and I thought that makes me think he's going to grow into the role and regret that he gave it over to the government. I don't think we can trust the government in this case, in this series, necessarily. And I think there's going to be, like, the bad guys who, great flying squirrel outfits, just as an aside, little wingsuits. But I think it's going to be a lot of gray areas, because they open up the fact they're going to be talking about systemic racism. They're going to be talking about doing therapy and emotional work and recovery of different kinds. I think they're dealing with things really head on in a way that I don't remember, at least off the top of my head, that Marvel has done before. In this series, it looks like it's going to be really explicit that they're dealing with it.
I'll leave the ending where they introduce the new Captain America for a moment, because the scene between the brother and sister, Sam and his sister, when they were around the boat, kind of hashing out what to do, that actually reminded me of the parable of the prodigal son. The way it reminded me was it was the sister who stayed, as in the prodigal son, it's the older son. But it was the sister who stayed, who lived through the blip and did all the work and tried to hold everything together. And now I can't tell if I don't think they're twins, but I couldn't tell who was older or who was younger. But anyway, the brother returns and he's ready to take over again. And she's like, wait a minute, I've been doing this for 5 years. I know what I'm doing. And, we just can't sustain this anymore. And she's ready to move on with her life. And it seemed like he, first of all, he just showed up and like, I'm the boy. I'm here to, save the day. But number two was that he didn't realize he was just picking up his life from 5 years ago. And obviously he had no experience at what had happened in those 5 years, but there seemed to be a pretty big knowledge gap on his.
And I thought that was really sympathetic, too, because, I mean, you can only imagine just coming back and it feels like no time at all has passed. It would be really hard to rationalize the fact that, your sister has had this chance to grow out of and be ready to move on from the family business. It's relationships are hard, maybe another recurring theme. But I hope we get to see more of that family, because the nephews were really cute.
So what about the ending? And that's where they introduced the new Captain America. First of all, let me ask you first, how did you feel when you saw that scene, just emotionally?
I was so angry. I felt so angry. It felt so unfair. That was the biggest emotional impact that I had. What was your emotional response to that?
I think I was more disgusted. And the square jaw, that was it for me. I'm like, they just brought this guy out from Central Casting, and he looks bad. He looks much worse in the mask than he does.
It's not the most flattering headgear of all time. But
we certainly don't have the Captain America butt.
That's America's butt.
That's America's butt. So we're missing that. And just the cheesy way he looked, And I thought back to in the first Captain America movie when he was being introduced across America as Captain America, and he was fumbling his lines and really unsure of himself and a little bit nervous. And we really saw none of that. And I just attributed that to complete fakeness. So I was, and then he smiled, and that for me was just the creme de la creme.
Yeah, I had down that he looked like he was going to be willing propaganda.
See, I was thinking, what superpowers does this Joker have? How's he going to save anybody? But don't forget, Batman didn't have superpowers, so he fought a lot of crime. But I thought that was a really interesting way. And what I had not fully appreciated, because I haven't read comics for so long, was that there's an entire storyline around him and in the Marvel comics, and that they are largely, not largely, but fairly, I think, following that story arc of another Captain America, so that they're actually grounded in, the Marvel cinematic or the Marvel comic universe. So I felt increased comfort for that, because that will lead us somewhere. But I must say that, and then I went from disgust to disappointment of where we were going next.
Yeah, and I thought there was one, this just kind of rubbing salt on the wound, and I had to go back and check it, but he was introduced by the same government official that told Sam he was doing the right thing by giving up the shield. So this had obviously been planned, and this had been orchestrated.
Right.
It's so infuriating. Yeah, so infuriating.
For our synopsis for episode 2, entitled Star Spangled Man, Walker appears on Good Morning America and reveals his desire to live up to Steve Rogers' mantle. Bucky Barnes tells Wilson that he should have kept the shield, and decides to accompany Wilson to Munich, where the Flag Smashers and their leader, Harley Morgenthau, are stealing a shipment of medicine. Wilson and Barnes attack the group in yet another spectacular fight scene. But this group of Flag Smashers are all super soldiers and overpower Wilson and Barnes. Walker and his sidekick, Lamar Hoskins, arrive to help, but the Flag Smashers all escape. Walker wants to work with Barnes and Wilson, the new Captain America, I should say, but they refuse. They then go to Baltimore, where in a really troubling, fascinating, and interesting scene, Barnes introduces Wilson to Bucky, that is, introduces the Falcon to Isaiah Bradley, a veteran super soldier who had fought the Winter Soldier, i.e. Bucky, back in the Korean War days. That's the early 1950s. Bradley refuses to help them uncover information about additional super soldiers due to his treatment from the American government. He was imprisoned and he was experimented on by the U.S. government and Hydra for nearly 30 years. Then he was released from prison. I think he was pardoned, but that may be a little unclear. Barnes is arrested in just a horrific scene in front of Wilson's house. The police roll up and harass both of them. Bucky, of course, being white, is not as badly harassed as Sam is. And they finally recognize who Sam is, and so they are about to let him go, but it turns out Bucky's missed an appointment for therapy, so he's arrested for violating a condition of his parole or probation. They get Bucky released, and then in what I thought, I'll just say, I won't say how I thought, was an interesting scene. They have a joint therapy session. Barnes and Wilson then again refuse to Walker, and Barnes Bucky suggests to Sam that they visit the imprisoned Helmut Zemo for a talk about Hydra's tentacles still across the globe, which I thought was a delicious, tantalizing teaser. So what were some of the cookies and other cool stuff that you saw in episode 2, Megan?
I giggled embarrassingly at the big three, so aliens, androids, and wizards. And I did fact check Bucky on, I read it the year it came out in 1937. That is the year The Hobbit came out. So well done, researchers. But yeah, the argument about what makes a wizard, are wizards real? That was fantastic. The Flag Smashers stealing medicine. I thought that was a really interesting move because that's not usually the super villain play. They weren't stealing jewels or weapons. They were stealing vaccines. So who were these for? Where are they going? I think they're being set up, kind of as we touched on a little bit earlier, as not wholly evil. There's going to be a lot of shades of gray that we're dealing with there. And all the super soldiers, where did they come from? Who made them super soldiers? That was very fascinating. It sounds like we're going to be getting to the therapy session eventually, so that will be fantastic. New captain, Walker, and Lamar Hoskins. I think there's comic book history there too, isn't there? I saw that in a few comics, but I have not personally read the comics. Please don't at me because I'm not on Twitter. But yeah, so now there's two pairs of people who are. I think maybe their relationships are going to be made better with each other by their contrast to the other group. Is probably the way it's going to go. And the big thing, and I think this theme came up at several points in the episode. A lot of Bucky's problems are personal, and a lot of Sam's problems are systemic. So Bucky's got to do all this internal work, and he's dealing with his own emotions about having, done these things. The guilt, is it his? Should it be internal or external? How are people going to treat him now? And Sam is being systemically discriminated against on the basis of his race. And a lot of his conflict seems to be it's being imposed upon him rather than being generated internally. Not that he doesn't have internal problems as well. I'm sure he does. But the big things he has to face are systemic and faced by many and not strictly internal to him. Those were my episode 2 thoughts. What were yours?
So, first of all, Carly Morgenthau, and I can't remember the name of the actress playing her, but I thought she did a fabulous job. And I don't say she's a Blythe size, but she's thin. And she certainly would not be one you would think is enhanced or a super soldier, yet she has super soldier strength.
I mean, I grew up on Buffy, so that that read really clean to me.
Okay. So about the best I got was Batgirl. So, but I thought she did great. And we saw her in multiple scenes. We saw her in action scenes. We saw her in scenes where she was being chased. We saw her in scenes where she was having to be persuasive. And we saw her in scenes where I thought she was incredibly intellectual. And so I saw a great range from her. And it made me think this is going to be a multifaceted villain that we can, if she's a villain, that we can follow kind of throughout. Once again, I was I moved from disgust to irritation with the new Captain the new Captain America, particularly in the scene where after they're whipped by the flag raisers and they're walking / riding in a Jeep, and they're trying to convince Bucky and Sam to work with them, the new Captain America and his sidekick. I found that incredibly irritating. So I really didn't fully appreciate that. The Isaiah Bradley, first of all, that's also a storyline in prior Marvel comics, which I was not aware of at all. And so I've read as much as I can find about that. But there's really, when I saw that scene, that as a Southerner brings up for me the Tuskegee medical experiments. Mm-hmm. And for those who may not know what that is, unfortunately, the U.S. government conducted some horrific medical experiments on African Americans in the Deep South, in Tuskegee, Alabama, for about 40 years. And what they did was basically take men who had untreated syphilis and not ever treat them so they could see the effects. And that, and so that's really when you talk about that type of treatment in America, that's really what that brings up for a lot of people my age. And so not knowing his Marvel comic universe backstory, that's where I went to in that scene. But he was clearly mistreated by the U.S. government. He was abused mentally. He was abused physically, thrown in prison after having fought for the United States. And I think that was the experience of many Black Americans, certainly after World War II, and probably after Korea. having said all that, it was those men who led the U.S. civil rights movement because of what they had learned, the discipline and character they had learned in the Army. So some good came out of their armed forces experience. But Bradley is one angry man, and he is still angry. And I'm sure we're going to see him again because he obviously knows things that Bucky and Sam need to find out. So that was kind of powerful scene one. But then the scene outside his house where the police roll up and immediately start to question both of them. And it's basically they question Bucky because he's a white guy in a black neighborhood. And it's like, what are you guys doing here? And they ask for ID, and Bucky gives them his ID, just like I would give him my ID. And he says, Sam, give him your ID. Well, Sam doesn't have ID. And so that leads us down what I thought was going to be a very bad path, but somebody recognizes Sam. But that's when they find out Bucky's violated his parole and he has to be arrested. So if our listeners don't know, you're not an American. So what does a Canadian looking at kind of all of those scenes see from her perspective?
Canada certainly doesn't have clean hands when it comes to racism. And we also get a lot of American news. So I had been aware of the Tuskegee experiments, and seeing that relayed so clearly it's hard watching, because you can only imagine someone who's had that lived experience of being the same as America's idol and treated so differently, while the news and the media and the culture and at school, you're learning, oh, everything's equal. It's a meritocracy now. And just brutal example of it. And then taking that immediately into the outside scene with the police, I had a slightly different interpretation of it, because I noticed they asked Bucky, is he bothering you? Referring to Sam. And it seemed like, they were racially profiling him. And it very much, like you hear about in the news happening all the time. You could have been shot, could have been arrested, could have been really harmed. So like, what a day. what an emotional experience to have. And I can't imagine what it'd be like to be watching this. Like, we're both white people. What would it like being watching this if we were black? Like, how clear would that be? How resonant would that be? I can't really imagine. But yeah, kind of like, as we said before, they're not shying away from that hard stuff. And I really hope they're going to address it a lot more, because it's certainly of the moment. And that's like what Sam said at the beginning, we need heroes for the time that we're in. We also need TV for the time that we're in.
So did your experience with the Marvel Cinematic Universe give you any hints that there were additional U.S. super soldiers?
I don't remember having the thought, oh, there must be more super soldiers. Although, now that it's been presented, thinking back, if a government had the power to make super soldiers, it is hard to imagine that they would not make as many super soldiers as they could. But no, I hadn't really thought that there were more.
I remember once again in the first Captain America, where basically the designer of the program was murdered, and then the equipment itself, I think, was destroyed. And so I just assumed that was the end of it. But you're right; it makes sense if they could create one, if they could reformulate the formula and try it again. And obviously they did. But it also makes me wonder: were there other American super soldiers besides Bradley out there?
Have they super soldiered new Captain America?
I don't think so. And that irritates me too. But I just don't think a regular guy ought to be out there claiming he's Captain America if he's not on stage. So I really don't like him, obviously. Now we get to the therapy scene. And I've done couples therapy. I've never done couples therapy like that. It's always control your anger. You may have issues and you may have ugly things to say, but you can't present it like that. It has to be respectful. You have to say your piece, but then you have to listen to the other person. And I've certainly never touched someone while I was doing that part of the therapy. No, I've never done soul eyes.
You haven't done soul eyes? You haven't?
So have I missed the whole thing?
I can't imagine anything more awkward than soul eyes in a therapy room. I thought it was interesting. The therapist was immediately like, no, both of you come in together. Like, she very much assumed that they would have to be working together for the foreseeable future and needed to have a functioning relationship for that. But I'm not sure where she got that idea. Like, was there, why do they have to work together? I feel like I'm not entirely clear on that. I guess other than maybe efficiency, being able to cover more ground or do more things. And I'm sure they were playing some of it for laughs. Or maybe just military-issued therapy is a lot more tough love than commercially available therapy.
I've unfortunately not written down the name of the actress who plays the therapist, but she's perfect.
She's great.
She's good. If anyone listening has seen the series Bosch, she's the lieutenant in Bosch, and she has the most well-worn face look of just about any actress I've ever seen, and it's perfect. It's the weight of the world and worrying about everything. And if she's wearing makeup, it's with just a minimum of makeup, and it's incredibly impactful, just the way she looks, I think.
Yeah, so I absolutely loved her attitude and the way she was dealing with the situation of having to give therapy to these two recalcitrant heroes. Just like, I don't want to be here any more than you do, but let's get done what we have to get done, tick our boxes, and we can get back to our days.
So let me ask you about one scene we didn't talk about, which was earlier in the show where the new Captain America goes back to his hometown, gets to meet everybody in the football stadium. And in a Texan Friday Night Lights, all that, it's all true. Everything centers around football and the football stadium on Friday night. And I'm from a little town, so I certainly participated in that. But how did that whole sort of homespun shtick, coupled with what we now know as his resume of being a war hero and a fighting officer, and certainly a well-honed officer, what did that give you, make you feel, or what more did you want?
I thought it was interesting because I felt it really highlighted the difference between him and Steve Rogers. Because, in Captain America, he was a nobody before he became Captain America, and he was selected on the basis, of being that nobody. And, he had that scene where he jumped on the hand grenade. And one thing that the scientist who created the serum told him was, a weak man understands the value of strength, but a strong man doesn't. And that's not something you see reflected in New Captain America, who came, as a decorated hero, but without, understanding maybe what it would be like to not be that. And maybe he's got a tragic backstory that we'll find out about in the future. But I thought it was really interesting, and shows possibly a difference in the government's priorities for what Captain America is going to be now.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm feeling something very sinister by the U.S. government, and I don't know if S.H.I.E.L.D. is back around. If the agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Agent Phil will have to show up and help us understand something, but I do get the sense that the U.S. government really...
They've also got him holding a gun when he's just walking around to events and speeches and whatnot. And I don't think old Captain America did that unless he was actually in a battle,
America.
Which seems reasonable. I'm never used to seeing guns, but that seemed like an intentional choice.
Well, Megan, unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap this up because we're having way too much fun, but I'm looking forward to episode 3 this coming Friday, and then us getting together next week.
I can't wait.
This is Tom Fox again. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Popcorn and Compliance. Megan and I will be back together next week where we take a look at the next episode of Falcon and the Winter Soldier. You should check out some of the other offerings on the Compliance Podcast Network. We have a new offering of Coffee and Regs, and we have Mo Forecast, the podcast from the Morrison and Forster law firm, hosted by fan favorite from the FCPA Compliance Report, James Koukios. Thanks again for listening. Please join us again next week. This has been a special presentation of the Compliance Podcast Network.